people who shared with me their experience. And, during the campaign, it was what they hoped to see happen, the results of the policies. And that was bad, where people share their stories, where there'd be something really cynical about thinking they forget. Some do.
You help get people together. What's that take? Trying to get people to compromise, trying to get people to see the common humanity.
I think first and foremost, you have to be willing to talk with them. So, one of the policies I advocated for was paid family leave. We left, and 9 million more Americans had it through a combination of securing it for our federal workforce. I had people in the White House who were pregnant who didn't have access to paid leave. So we want to keep people attached to the workforce, yet when they have an important life event like a child, we create an impossibility for them. Some people don't even have access to unpaid leave if they're part-time workers. And so that, and then we also put in place the first ever national tax credit for workers making under $72,000 a year, where employers could then offer it to their workers. That was also part of tax cuts. So, part of it is really taking the arguments as to why this is good, smart, well-designed policy to people. And, it was one of my big surprises that on certain policy issues that I thought would have been well socialized, the policies that existed were never shared across the aisle. So people just lived with them, maybe in hopes that one day they would have the votes to get exactly what they want. But I was surprised by how little discussion there was. So I think part of it is be willing to have those tough discussions with people who may not share your viewpoint, and be an active listener when they point out flaws and they have suggestions for changes. Not believing that you have a monopoly on good ideas. And I think there has to be a lot of humility in architecting these things. And a policy should benefit from that type of well-rounded input.
Yeah, be able to see, like you said, well-designed policies. There's probably the details are important too. Like, there's just like with architecture, and you walk the rooms, there's probably really good designs of policies, like economic policy that helps families, that delivers the maximum amount of money or resources to families that need it, and is not a waste of money. So like that, there's probably really nice designs there, nice ideas that are bipartisan, that has nothing to do with politics, has to do with just great economic policy. It's good policies. And that requires listening.
Requires trust too. Like, I learned tax cuts was really interesting for me because I met with so many people across the political spectrum on advancing that policy. I really figured out who was willing to deviate from their talking points when the door was closed and who wasn't. And it takes some courage to do that, especially without surety that it would actually get done. Especially if they've campaigned on something that was slightly different. And, not everyone has that courage. So through tax cuts, I learned the people who did have that courage, and I went back to that well time and time again on policies that I thought were important. Some were bipartisan. The Great American Outdoors Act is something, it's incredible policy.
I love that one.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's one of the largest pieces of conservation legislation since the national park system was created. And, over 300 million people visit our national parks, the vast majority of them being Americans every year. So this is something that is real and beneficial for people's lives, getting rid of the deferred maintenance, permanently funding them. There are other issues like that just weren't being prioritized. Modernizing Perkins CTE, and vocational education. It's something I became super passionate about, and helped lead the charge on. I think in America for a really long period of time, we've really believed that education stops when you leave high school or college. And that is not true, and that's a dangerous way to think. So how can we both galvanize the private sector to ensure that they continue to train workers for the jobs they know are coming, they train their existing workforce into the new jobs with robotics or machinery or new technologies that are coming down the pike. So galvanizing the private sector to join us
Are we
in
rolling?
that effort. So whether it's the
Oh, fuck
legislative
yeah.
side, like the
Who's that?
actual
So, kick me out,
legislation
you.
of FERC and CP, which was focused on vocational education, or whether it's the ability
This
to
is
use the
fun.
White House to galvanize the private sector. We got over 16 million commitments from the private sector to retrain or reskill workers into the jobs of tomorrow.
Yeah, there's so many aspects of education that you helped on. Access to STEM and computer science education. Also, the CT thing you're mentioning, modernizing career and technical education. That's millions and millions of people. The act provided nearly $1.3 billion annually to more than 13 million students to better align the employer needs and all that kind of stuff. Very large scale policies that help a lot of people. It's fascinating.
Education often isn't like the bright, shiny object everyone's running towards. So one of the hard things in politics when there's something that is good policy, sometimes it has no momentum because it doesn't have a cheerleader. So where are areas of good policy that you can like literally just carry across the finish line? Because people tend to run towards what's the news of the day, sort of to try to address whatever issues being talked about on the front pages of papers. And there's so many issues that need to be addressed. And, education is one of them that's just under prioritized. Human trafficking. That's an issue that I didn't go to the White House thinking I would work on, but you hear a story of a survivor and you can't not want to eradicate one of the greatest evils that the mind can even imagine. The trafficking of people, the exploitation of children. And I think for so many, they assume that this is a problem that doesn't happen on our shores. Something that you may experience at far-flung destinations across the world, but it's happening there and it's happening here as well. And so through a coalition of people that, on both sides of the aisle, that I came to trust and to work well with, we were able to get legislation, which the president signed, passed 9 pieces of legislation combating trafficking at home and abroad and digital exploitation of children.
How much of a toll does that take? Seeing all the problems in the world at such a large scale, enunciating it all. Was that hard to walk around with that, just knowing how much suffering there is in the world? As you're trying to help all of it, as you're trying to design government policies to help all of that, it's also a very visceral recognition that there is suffering in the world. How difficult is that to walk around with?
You feel it intensely. We were just talking about human trafficking. I mean, you don't design these policies in the absence of the input of survivors themselves. So you hear their stories. I remember a woman who was really influential in my thinking, Andrea Hepwell, who she was in college where she was lured out by a guy she thought was a good guy, started dating him. He gets her hooked on drugs, convinces her to drop out of college, and spends the next 5 years selling her. She only got out when she was arrested. And all too often that's happening too, that the victim's being targeted, not the perpetrator. We did a lot with DOJ around changing that. But now she's helping other survivors get skills and job training and the therapeutic interventions they need. But you speak with people like Andrea and so many others, and I mean, you can't not. Your heart gets seized by it, and it's both. It's motivating and it's hard. It's really hard.
I was just talking to a brain surgeon. Many of the surgery he has to do, he knows the chances are very low of success. And he says that wears at his armor. Yeah. It chips away. It's like only so many times can you do that.
And thank God he's doing it, because I bet you there are a lot of others that don't choose that particular field because of those low success rates.
But you could see the pain in his eyes, like maintaining your humanity while doing all of it. see the story, you can see the family that loves that person. Just you feel the immensity of that, and you feel the heartbreak involved with mortality in that case, and with suffering also in that case, and in general in all these human trafficking. Um, but even in helping families try to stay afloat, trying to break out or escape poverty, all of that, you get to see those stories of struggle. It's not easy. Um, but the people that really feel the humanity of that, feel the pain of that, are probably the right people to be politicians. But it's probably also why you can't stay in there too long.
It's the only time in my life where you actually feel like there's always a conflict, right, between work and life and making sure, as a woman, I'd often get asked about, how do you balance work and family? And I never liked that question because balance, it's like elusive, right? You're one, fever away from like no balance,
Right.
like your child's sick one day, what do you do? There goes balance, or you have a huge project with a deadline, there goes balance. Like, I think a better way to frame it is, am I living in accordance with my priorities? Maybe not every day, but every week and every month, and reflecting on, have you architected a life that aligns with your priorities, so that more often than not you're where you need to be in that moment. And service at that level was the one time where you feel incredibly conflicted about having any priorities other than serving. It's finite. In every business I've built, you're building for duration, you know. And then you go into the White House, and it stands for an hourglass, whether it's 4 years or 8 years. It's a finite period of time you have, and most people don't last 4 years. I think the average in the White House is 18 months. Exhausting. Um, but it's the only time when you're at home with your own children that you think about all the people you've met, and you feel guilty about any time that's spent not advancing those interests in to the best of your capacity. And that's a hard thing. That's a really hard feeling as a parent. And it's really challenging then to be present, to always need to answer your phone, to always need to be available. It's very difficult. It's taxing, but it's also the greatest privilege in the world.
So through that, the turmoil of that, the hardship of that, what was the role of family through all of that? Jared and the kids. What was that like?
That was everything. To have the support systems I had in place with my husband, and we had left New York and wound up in Washington. In New York, I lived 10 blocks away from my mother-in-law, who, if I wasn't taking my kids to school, she was. So we lost some of that, which was very hard, but we had what mattered, which was each other. And my kids were young when I got to Washington. Theo, my youngest, was 8 months old, and Arabella, my oldest, my daughter, was 5 years old. So they were still quite young. We have a son, Joseph, who's 3, and I think for me, like, the dose of levity coming home at night and having them there and just joyful, and it was super grounding and important for me. I still remember Theo, when he was around 3.5 years old. Jared used to make me coffee every morning, and it was like my great luxury that I would sit there. He still makes it for me every morning. I told him I'm never, I secretly know how to actually work the coffee machine, but I've convinced him that I have no idea how to work the coffee machine. Now I'm guilty, busted. But it's a skill I don't want to learn, because it's one of his like acts of love. He brings me coffee every morning in bed while I read the newspapers, and Theo would watch this, and so he got Jared to teach him how to make coffee, and Theo learned how to make like a full blown cappuccino. And he had so much joy in every morning bringing me this cappuccino. And I remember like the sound of his little steps, like the slide. And he was so cute coming down the hallway with
Yeah.
my like perfectly foamed cappuccino. Now I try to get him to make me coffee, and he's like, "Come on, mom." That was a moment in time, but we had a lot of like little moments like that that were just amazing. So
Yeah, I got a chance to chat with him, and he has his silliness and sense of humor is yeah, it's really joyful.
yeah,
I could see how that could be an escape from the madness of Washington, of the adult life, the
and they
quote
were
unquote
young
adult
enough.
life.
We really kept like our home life pretty sheltered from everything else, and we were able to do so because they were so young and because they weren't connected to the internet. They were too young for smartphones. All of these things, we were able to shelter and protect them and allow them to have as normal as upbringing as was possible in the context we were living. And and they've brought me like and continue to bring me so much joy. But they were, I mean, without Jared and without the kids, it would have been much more lonely.
So, 3 kids, you've now upgraded 2 dogs and a hamster.
Well, our second dog, we rescued him thinking we thought he was probably like part German Shepherd, part lab, is what we were told. He's now, I don't even know if he qualifies as a dog. He's the size of a horse. He's
Yeah,
a small
basically a
horse,
horse. Yeah.
Simba. So I don't think he has much lab in him. I think
Yeah.
Joseph has not wanted to do a DNA test because he really wanted a German Shepherd. So
It's
he's a German
gigantic.
Shepherd.
They are.
He's gigantic, and we also have a hamster, who's the newest addition because my son Theo, he tried to get a dog as well. Our first dog, Winter, became my daughter's dog as she wouldn't let her brothers play with him or sleep with him, and was old enough to bully them into submission. So then Joseph wanted a dog and got Simba. Theo now wants a dog and has Buster the hamster in the interim. So we'll see.
What advice would you give to other mothers just planning on having kids, and maybe advice to yourself on figuring out this puzzle?
I think being a parent, um, you have to cultivate within yourself like heightened levels of empathy. You have to really look at each child and see them for who they are, what they enjoy, what they love, and meet them where they're at. And I think that can be enormously challenging when your kids are so different in temperament. You know, as they get older, that difference in temperament may be within the same child depending on the moment of the day. Um, but it really, I think it's actually made me a much softer person, a much better listener. I think I see people more truly for who they are as opposed to how I want them to be sometimes. And I think being a parent to 3 children who are all exceptional and all incredibly different has enabled that in me. I think for me though, they've also been like some of my greatest teachers in that we were talking about the presence we felt when we were in the jungle and the connectivity we felt and sort of the simple joy. And I think for us as we grow older, we kind of disconnect from that. Like my kids have taught me how to play again. And that's beautiful. I remember just a couple of weeks ago, we had one of these crazy Miami torrential downpours. And Arabella comes down, it's around 8 o'clock at night. It's really raining. And she's got rain boots and pajama pants on, and she's going to take the dogs for a walk in the rain. Which, you know, she had all day to walk it, but she wasn't doing it because they needed to go for walks. She was like, this would be fun. And I'm standing at the doorstep watching her, and she goes out with Simba and Winter, this massive dog and this little tiny dog. And I'm watching her walk to the end of the driveway, and she's just dancing, and it's pouring. And I took off my shoes, and I went out, and I joined her, and we danced in the rain. And even as like a preteen who normally, she like allowed me to experience the joy with her, and it was amazing. We can be so much more fun if we allow ourselves to be more playful. We can be so much more present. I look at Theo loves games. We play a whole lot of board games, any kind of game. So it started with board games. We do a lot of puzzles. Then it became card games. I just taught him how to play poker.
Nice.
He loves backgammon, like any kind of game, and he's so fully in them. You know, when he plays, he plays. My son Joseph, he loves nature. And he'll say to me sometimes when, like, I'm taking a picture of something he's observing, like a beautiful sunset, he's like, Mom, just experience it. You're right, Joseph, just experience it. You know, so those kids have taught me so much about sort of reconnecting with what's real and what's true, and being present in the moment, and experiencing joy.
They almost give you permission to sort of reignite the inner child, to
Yep.
be a kid again. Yeah. And it's interesting what you said, the puzzle of noticing each human being, like what makes them beautiful, the unique characteristics, like what they're good at,
Yeah.
the way they want to be mentored. Like I often see that, especially with coaches and athletes, young athletes aspiring to be great. Each athlete needs to be trained in a different way. Like for example, with some you need a softer approach. Like with me, I always like a dictatorial approach. I like the coach to be this like menacing figure. That's when that brought out the best in me. I didn't want to be friends with the coach. Like I wanted almost, weird to say, but yelled at, like to be pushed. But that doesn't work for everybody. And that's a risk you have to take as in the coach context of like, because you can't just yell at everybody.
Yeah.
You have to figure out like what does each person need, and when uh, you have kids, I imagine the puzzle is even harder.
And when they all need different things, but yet coexist and are sometimes competitive with one another. So you'll be at a dinner table, the amount of times I get, well, that's not fair. Why did you let? And I'm like, life isn't fair. And by the way, like, I'm not here to be fair. I'm like, I'm trying to give you equal treatment. Especially when I've been working really hard, and in the White House, I say, okay, well, now we have a Sunday, and we have these hours, and I'll have like a grand plan, and we're gonna make it count. It's gonna involve, hot chocolate and sleds, whatever it is that, like, my great adventure, that we're gonna go play mini golf, and then I come down all psyched up, all ready to go, and because of zero interest. And there have been a lot of times where I've been like, we're doing this thing. And then I realized, wait a second, like sometimes you just like plop down on the floor and start playing magnet tiles, and like that's where they need you. And so those of us who have sort of like alpha personalities, who sometimes it's just witness, like witness what they need. Don't like play with them and allow them to lead the play. Don't force them down a road you may think is more interesting or productive or educational or edifying. Just be with them, observe them, and then show them that you are genuinely curious about the things that they are genuinely curious about. I think there's a lot of love when you do that.
Also, there's this fascinating puzzles. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and she has 4 kids, and they fight a lot. And she generally wants to break up the fights, but she's like, I'm not sure if I'm just supposed to let them fight and they figure it out, but you always break them up because I'm told that it's okay for them to fight. Kids do that. They kind of figure out their own situation. That's part of like the growing up process. But you want to always, especially if it's physical, they're like pushing each other. You want to kind of stop it. But at the same time, it's also part of the play, part of the dynamics. And that's a puzzle you also have to figure out. And plus, you're probably worried that they're going to get hurt if they're.
Well, I think there's like, when it gets physical,
Yeah.
That's like, okay, we have to intervene. I know you're into martial arts, but that's normally like the red line.
Yeah, sure.
Once it tips into that, but there is always that. Like you have to allow them to problem solve for themselves. Like a little interpersonal conflict is good. It's really hard when you try to navigate something because everyone thinks you're taking their side. You have oftentimes incomplete information. It's I think for parents, what tends to happen too is we see our kids fighting with each other in a way that all kids do, and we start to project into the future and like catastrophize. If like my two sons are going through a moment where they're like oil and water. Anything one wants to do, the other doesn't want to do. It's like a very interesting moment. So my instinct is they're not going to like each other when they're 25. You know, you sort of project into the future as opposed to recognizing this is a stage that I too went through and it's normal and not building it in your mind into something that's unnecessarily consequential.
It's short-term formative conflict.
Yeah.
So, uh, ever since 2016, the number and the level of attacks you've been under has been steadily increasing. It's been super intense. How do you walk through the fire of that? You've been very stoic about the whole thing. Don't think I've ever seen you respond to an attack. You just let it pass over you. You stay positive and you focus on solving problems. You didn't engage while being in DC. You didn't engage into the back and forth fire of the politics. So what's your philosophy behind that?
I appreciate your saying that I was very stoic about it. I think, I feel things pretty deeply. So initially, some of that really took me off guard. Like some of the derivative love and hatred, um, some of the intensity of the attacks. Um, and there were times when it was so easy to counter it. I'd even write
What?
something out
8 overtimes?
and say, "Well, I'm gonna press send," and never did. I felt that sort of getting into the mud, fighting back, it didn't run true to who I am as a human being. Like it didn't. It felt at odds with with who I am and how I want to spend my time. So I think as a result, I was oftentimes on the receiving end of a lot of cheap shots, and I'm okay with that because it's sort of the way I know how to be in the world. I was focused on things I thought mattered more, and I think part of me also internalized. There's a concept in Judaism called lashon hara, which is translated into, I think, quite literally evil speech, and the idea that speaking poorly of another is almost the moral equivalent to murder because you can't really repair it. You can apologize, but you can't repair it. Another component of that is that it does as much damage to the person saying the words um, than it does to the person receiving them. And I think about that a lot. I talk about this concept with my kids a lot. Um, and I'm not willing to pay the price of that fleeting and momentary satisfaction of sort of swinging back because I think it would be too expensive for my soul, and that's how I kind of made peace with it because I think that feels more true for me. But it is a little bit contrarian in politics. It's um, definitely a contrarian viewpoint to not get into the fray. Actually, someday I love Dolly Parton says that she doesn't condemn or criticize; she loves to incite, and I like that. It feels right for me.
I also like that you said that words have power. It's not. Sometimes people say, well, words, when you speak negatively of others, that's just words. But I think there's a cost to that. There's a cost, like you said, to your soul, and there's a cost in terms of the damage it can do to the other person, whether it's to their reputation publicly or to them privately, just as a human being psychologically, and in the place that it puts them, because they start thinking negatively in general, and then maybe they respond, and there's this vicious downward spiral that happens. That almost like we don't intend to, but it destroys everybody in the process. You quoted Alan Watts in saying, quote, "You're under no obligation to be the same person you were 5 minutes ago." So, how have the years in DC and the years after changed you?
I love Alan Watts too. I listen to his lectures sometimes falling asleep. He's got like and on planes. He's got like the most soothing voice. But I love what he said about you have no obligation to be who you were 5 minutes ago. because we should always feel that we have the ability to evolve and grow and better ourselves. I think further than that, if we don't look back on who we were a few years ago with some level of embarrassment, we're not growing enough, right? So there's nothing, when I look back, I'm like, oh, you know, I feel like that, that feeling is, because you're growing into hopefully, sort of a better version of yourself. And I hope and feel that that's been true for me as well. I think the person I am today, we spoke um, in in the beginning of our discussion about some of my earliest ambitions in real estate and in fashion, and those were amazing adventures and incredible experiences in government. And I feel today that all of those ambitions are more fully integrated into me as a human being.
That's kind of good stuff.
I'm much more comfortable with the various pieces of my personality, and that any professional drive is more integrated into
What is this?
more simple pleasures. Like everything for me has gotten like much simpler and easier in terms of what I want to do and what I want to be, and um, I think that's where my kids
What
have been my
is it?
teachers, just being fully present um, and enjoying like the little moments. And it doesn't mean I'm any less like driven than I was before. It's just more a part of me than um, being sort of the all-consuming energy one has in their 20s.
Yeah, just like you said with your mom, be able to let go,
Yeah.
enjoy the water, the sun, the beach,
I like how you're trying to
enjoy
get
the moment, the
Oh, like-
simplicity of the moment.
I think a lot about the fact that for a lot of young people, they they really know what they want to do,
Bitches.
but they don't actually know who they are. And then I think as you get older, hopefully you know who you are, and you're much more comfortable with ambiguity around what you want to do and accomplish. You're more flexible in your thinking around those things.
And give yourself permission to be who you are.
Yeah.
You made the decision not to engage in the politics of the 2024 campaign. If it's okay, let me read what you wrote on the topic. Quote, I love my father very much. This time around, I'm choosing to prioritize my young children and the private life we're creating as a family. I do not plan to be involved in politics. While I will always love and support my father going forward, I will do so outside the political arena. I'm grateful to have had the honor of serving the American people, and I will always be
25
proud
minutes ago.
of many of our administration's accomplishments. So, can you explain your thinking, your philosophy behind that decision?
I think
You
first and
really don't
foremost,
give a
it
shit.
was a decision rooted in me being a parent, really thinking about what they need from me now. Politics is a rough business, and I think it's one that you also can't dabble in. I think you have to either be all in or all out, and I know today the cost they would pay for me being all in. Emotionally, in terms of my absence at such a formative point in their life, and I'm not willing to make them bear that cost. I served for 4 years and feel so privileged to have done it, but as their mom, I think it's really important that I do what's right for them. And I think there are a lot of ways you can serve. I think there's obviously the scale of what can she like enjoys what she does, and you also have the sense that if she didn't, she wouldn't do it.
That's right. And just an iconic country musician, country music singer.
Yeah.
There's a lot. We've talked about a lot of musicians. Who do you enjoy? You mentioned Adele, seeing her perform, hanging out with her.
Yeah, I mean, she's extraordinary. Her voice is unreal. So I find her to be so talented, and she's so unique in that 3-year-olds love her music. She was actually the first concert Arabella ever went to at Madison Square Garden when she was around 4, and 90-year-olds love her music, and that's pretty rare to have that kind of um, bandwidth of resonance. So I think she's so talented. We actually just saw her. I took all 3 kids in Las Vegas around a month ago. Alice Johnson, whose case I had worked with in the White House. My father commuted her sentence by a friend, Kim Kardashian, and she came to the show. We all went together with some mutual friends, and that was like a very profound. It was amazing to see Adele, but it was a very profound experience for me to have with my kids because she rode with us in the car on the way to the show, and she talked to my kids about her experience and her story, and how her case found its way to me. And I think for young children, it's very abstract, policy. And so for her to be able to share with them this was a very beautiful moment and led to a lot of really